I've always believed that the worst part of aging was silence. The house gets too big, the days too long, and we start talking to ourselves without realizing it. That morning, I woke up like so many others, weak coffee, stale bread, and the clock marking hours that seemed not to pass. Nothing indicated that my life was about to turn upside down. The phone rang shortly after 9. I looked at the display with strangeness, because almost no one cared anymore. When I answered, an overly polite voice introduced itself as a bank employee. She asked to confirm my full name, and then said something that made my stomach sink. My main account had been closed at my request, made 2 days earlier. I laughed. I laughed out of nervousness, out of incredulity. He said that there must be a mistake, that I had not been to any bank, that I hardly left the house. On the other end of the line, there was a professional silence, followed by a cold sentence. "Here is your authorization, Mrs. Helena, with all legal powers." My hands began to tremble. I asked him to repeat it, as if hearing it again could change the meaning of those words. The woman explained that the funds had already been transferred and that any further clarification should be handled with my legal representative. Legal representative. That expression echoed in my head like a cracked bell. When I hung up, I stared at my phone for a few seconds, trying to organize my thoughts. The memory came too clearly, my son sitting in front of me, months before, speaking calmly, saying that this was just a formality. "It's to protect you, Mom," he said. And I signed it, trusting more in love than on paper. I got up slowly and went to the mailbox, still with my heart racing. Between advertisements and common bills, there was a different envelope, with letters too hard to ignore. I opened it right there, standing, feeling the air running out when I read that my house was in arrears and could go into the collection process. I sat on the first step of the balcony because my legs no longer obeyed me. The house where I lived for decades, where I buried my husband, where I raised my son, now had a notice threatening to get me out of there. And all this without me having done anything, without me having been warned. The scariest thing was not the fear of losing money or the house. It was the feeling of being erased. Decisions made in my name, my signature used against me, my voice replaced by another. It was as if I was still breathing, but I didn't really exist anymore. I picked up the phone again, this time to call my son. He took a long time to answer. When he answered, his voice sounded impatient, as if I was getting in the way of something important. I explained, confused, what the bank had said. On the other side, he sighed and replied, "Mom, we've already talked about this. You've been forgetting things." That phrase hurt me more than any financial threat. Because, in that instant, I realized that the problem was not just what they were taking from me. It was the story they were building about who I was. And if I didn't react, that story would be the only one left. That day, something changed inside me. It was not yet strength, nor courage. It was just a silent warning. But it was there, sitting on the porch of my own house, that I understood, someone was deciding my life for me. And I needed to find out who I had become without realizing it. The fact that you're here, choosing to hear this story so far, says a lot about who you are. What follows isn't just something I've experienced, it's a truth that many people face in silence, at home, within their own family. If you believe that stories like this deserve to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel. This is the simplest way to support so that these voices are not erased. I spent that night without sleep. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, while every crack in the house felt like a warning that something was about to end. I never thought that walls could carry fear, but there they were, full of memories and now of threat. The word default did not leave my head, as if it had been iron engraved. The next morning, I woke up with a strange feeling of invasion. Nothing had been physically moved, but everything seemed out of place. I brewed the coffee with slow hands, trying to convince myself that I still had control over something. I repeated to myself that there had to be a simple explanation, a bureaucratic error, something that did not involve betrayal. I picked up the letter again and read each line more carefully. He spoke of delays, deadlines, possible legal measures. My name was there, clearly printed, as if I had been the author of it all. The feeling was that I was being accused of a crime that I did not commit, but of which no one doubted. I decided to call the bank personally. I didn't want to talk to automatic attendants or to voices trained not to feel. When I finally managed to talk to someone, I heard the same explanation again, now accompanied by details that hurt even more. There was a signature, a date, a formal request made on my behalf through the power of attorney. The word proxy came back like a punch. I remembered the day I signed that paper. My son had taken everything ready. He said it was just to make it easier, that I didn't have to worry about anything. "You trust me, don't you?" he asked. And I trusted. I trusted without reading, without suspecting, without imagining that that gesture would be used as a key to lock me out of my own life. I walked around the house slowly, running my hand over the furniture, as if I needed to confirm that they were still there. Each corner carried a story: the scratch on the wall that marked my son's height, the armchair where my husband used to sleep after lunch, the window from which I had observed the neighborhood for years. Thinking about losing it all was like losing pieces of me. The cruelest thing was to realize that no one had warned me. No conversation, no request, no explanation. They simply decided. And they decided for me. I began to understand that it was not just about money, but about something deeper. Someone had assumed the right to choose my destiny. When my son showed up that day, he entered the house as if he owned it. He looked around, assessing everything with a look too quickly. He spoke of accounts, adjustments, necessary decisions. He didn't ask how I was. He did not mention the letter. He only stated that he was solving everything. I tried to confront him, but my words came out weak, confused. He responded with forced patience, that tone that mixes superiority and false concern. He said that I needed to rest, that he would take care of everything, that I shouldn't stress about matters that I didn't understand so well anymore. It was at that moment that something broke inside me. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't argue. I just watched. I observed how he spoke for me, decided for me and, above all, how he diminished me without realizing it. I understood, with painful clarity, that this house was still standing, but it no longer belonged to me. After that day, I began to pay attention to things that had previously gone unnoticed. It was not paranoia, as he insisted on saying. It was instinct. Something inside me warned me that I needed to observe in silence. I started to measure words, to listen more than to speak, to pretend that I accepted explanations that made no sense at all. My son started to show up more often. Always in a hurry, always talking on the phone, always deciding something while I was there, sitting, invisible. When I asked, he answered with vague sentences, full of difficult terms, as if I were incapable of understanding my own life. That was not taken care of. It was control. One afternoon, I mustered up the courage to insist. I asked directly about the closed account, about the house letter, about where my money had gone. He took a deep breath, crossed his arms and looked at me as if he were in front of a stubborn child. "Mom, you've been getting confused," I said, with a rehearsed calm that made me nauseous. Those words were suspended in the air. Confusing. As if my memories were flawed, as if my perception had no value. He kept talking, explaining that everything had been done for my good, that I didn't remember because I was under stress, that doctors had already warned about it. Doctors I've never seen say anything like that. I felt ashamed. Shame on doubting myself. Embarrassed to think that maybe he was right. That's how it starts, I realized later. They don't need to arrest you or shut you up. Just plant doubt. Just repeat, sweetly, that you are no longer trustworthy. That night, I cried alone in the room. It wasn't a loud cry, it was a contained cry, of someone who doesn't want to be heard. I cried because of the feeling of slipping out of my own history, as if someone was rewriting my life while I was still alive. I started to write things down in an old notebook that I found in the drawer. Dates, phrases, events. If I was getting confused, then I needed proof for myself. Each note was a small act of resistance, even if I was not yet aware of it. I also noticed that some letters stopped coming. I asked him about a specific account, and he said he had already solved it. I asked to see it, and he changed the subject. Gradually, the world became smaller, more closed, as if I was being pushed into a box too comfortable to be questioned. The cruelest thing was that everything was accompanied by a speech of love. He said he loved me, that he just wanted to protect me, that I needed to trust him. And for a moment, I almost believed it. I almost gave up fighting that strange sensation that screamed inside me. But every time he said, "You're confused, Mom," something would light up. A small, stubborn flame that refused to go out. I could be fragile, scared, hurt. But confused. I wasn't yet. And that silent certainty began to be my anchor. The changes did not come all at once. They settled in slowly, almost politely, like visitors who don't ask for permission, but also don't make noise. That's how I began to realize that my home was no longer a neutral space. It was becoming a watched place, controlled by decisions I didn't make. The first sign was the telephone. One morning, I looked for him at the living room table and couldn't find it. I asked my son, and he replied matter-of-factly that he had taken it to fix it, because I was always complaining. I didn't remember complaining, but I accepted, once again, to avoid argument. Then came the visits. The neighbor who used to stop by for a coffee stopped appearing. When I asked, I heard that I needed to rest more, that visits made me agitated. Gradually, people were being pushed away in my name, as if I had asked for isolation without knowing it. The letters started to arrive open. Some simply did not arrive. When I asked, he said that he had already solved everything, that I didn't have to worry. That phrase became a dangerous mantra, repeated whenever I tried to understand what was happening. I realized that even my medical appointments were being controlled. Dates changed, doctors were changed, information came filtered. I was present, but never fully informed. It was like watching my own life through a frosted glass. I began to feel afraid to ask questions. Not because he shouted or threatened, but because each question was accompanied by a tired look, a heavy sigh, a comment about how difficult it was for him. Guilt became an invisible collar. At night, I walked around the house in silence, listening to my own footsteps, as if I were trespassing on a forbidden place. I opened drawers, checked cabinets, touched papers just to remember that I still could. Each simple gesture seemed like a small act of rebellion. The scariest thing was to realize how everything was done with an appearance of care. Nothing was explicit. There were no direct orders, only insistent suggestions, practical decisions, choices made for my good. It was a kind of prison without bars, where the door always seemed open, but leaving was not allowed. I began to understand that the most effective control is not the one that hurts the body, but the one that weakens confidence. When you start to doubt yourself, anyone else seems more apt to decide for you. Even so, something inside me resisted. I might be surrounded by small invisible prisons, but I still had free thoughts. And as long as I could think, remember, and observe, I still wasn't completely defeated. It was on a rainy afternoon that I decided to go through the old drawers. Not out of courage, but out of desperation. The house seemed even quieter that day, as if it was also holding its breath. I opened the first drawer without expectation, just trying to occupy my mind so as not to sink into thoughts. I found yellowed photographs, old receipts, letters that my husband had carefully kept. Each roll was a piece of my life, proof that I existed before all that. I kept moving, feeling a lump in my throat, until my fingers touched a thick paste, hidden under old towels. When I opened it, I felt my heart race. They were copies of legal documents, too old to be recent, but clear enough to chill me inside. There was a formal attempt at interdiction made years ago. My name, my address, and my son's signature as an applicant. It took me a few seconds to understand what I was seeing. I read and reread it, hoping that my eyes were mistaken. But they weren't. That meant that the idea of taking control of my own life hadn't come up now. It was old, planned, stored waiting for the right moment. I sat on the living room floor with the briefcase on my lap. I remembered vague discussions from the past, times when he insisted that I needed too much help, comments about my age made with false concern. It all started to make sense in a very painful way. The betrayal was not impulsive. It was not the result of a recent mistake. It was a plan that slept in silence, waiting for a breach. And I myself had delivered this loophole when I signed the power of attorney, trusting in the love of a son who had tried to erase me before. I cried, but not like before. It was not a cry of confusion or fear. It was a cry of mourning. I was burying the image I had of him, the idea that all that was taken care of. That discovery killed something inside me, and, strangely, strengthened something else. I kept the documents carefully, as if hiding a gun. For the first time, I had something concrete. Something that could not be explained as forgetfulness, nor dismissed as confusion. That was proof of intent. At that moment, I understood that the past never sleeps. He waits. And when it wakes up, it demands that you do something with the truth you brought. I was still scared, I still felt small. But she was no longer blind. I got up from the ground with difficulty, feeling the weight of the years and discovery. I looked around, at my house, at my things, at my history. They had tried to convince me that I was disappearing. But there, holding that briefcase, I knew, I was still whole. And now, awake. After the discovery, I started to see the world in a different way. It was no longer just what happened inside my house. That was what happened outside of it. In the market, in the pharmacy, on the sidewalk. People looked at me with a new kind of care, the kind that comes mixed with pity and distrust. I started to hear loose phrases, said as if they didn't want to say anything. Your son is so dedicated. It's a good thing you have someone to take care of things. At this age, it's really hard to keep up with everything. Each comment seemed innocent, but together they formed a story that was not mine. I realized that he was speaking for me everywhere. Explaining absences, justifying behaviors, creating an image of a confused, fragile, almost absent woman. And the most painful thing was knowing that I was there, alive, lucid, listening to everything, and being erased at the same time. An old neighbor, who has always been direct with me, hesitated before speaking. He asked, with excessive care, if I was feeling well in my head. That question, asked in a low voice, pierced me like a blade. It was not curiosity. It was a planted doubt. I returned home with my chest tightened. I sat in the living room and stared into space, trying to understand how my reputation was being dismantled without me having done anything wrong. The feeling was that I was being judged in an invisible court, where I had no right to speak. When I confronted my son, he denied it with frightening ease. He said I was misinterpreting, that people cared about me, that I was too sensitive. Again, the narrative of exaggeration, confusion, fragility. He spoke as if he had already rehearsed everything. I came to understand that this story was not just about money or legal power. It was about total control. If people believed that I was unwell, any decision made against me would seem justifiable. Even get me out of the house. Even silence me for good. Loneliness began to weigh on her in a different way. It was no longer the loneliness of those who live alone. It was the loneliness of those who are not believed, of those who speak and feel that the words dissolve before reaching the other. Even so, I stood firm inside. I continued to write everything down in my notebook. Every sentence, every strange look, every change in behavior. If they were building a narrative against me, I needed to build my own, with facts. It was at this point that I realized something important. They saw me as weak because they wanted to. Because that made everything easier. But weakness is not the same as silence. And I still had a voice. Even if it was just for me, for now. That night, I carefully closed the notebook and hid it again. I was being underestimated by everyone. And for the first time, I understood that this could become an advantage. They thought I had already lost. I knew I was still starting. The fear changed shape after that day. Before, it was diffuse, scattered, almost abstract. Now, it had an address, date, and consequence. It was no longer just the feeling of being manipulated. It was the certainty that I could lose everything in an official, documented, irreversible way. The confirmation came when I found, by chance, a notice hidden among old papers. A formal communication about the possibility of selling the property to pay off debts. My house. Written in cold, technical letters, as if there were no memories, only numbers. I felt the ground disappear under my feet. My first reaction was to deny it. I folded the paper and put it away as if, out of sight, it ceased to exist. I spent hours walking around the house, touching the walls, opening doors, as if I was saying goodbye without admitting it. Each room seemed to ask me how much time we had left together. The cruelest thing was to realize that everything was happening within the law. Or, at least, of a distorted law to my disadvantage. The power of attorney turned any decision into something legitimate, even when it was deeply unfair. I wasn't being robbed by force. It was being dismantled with authorization. I started thinking about the word interdiction more often. Not as a distant concept, but as a real threat. All it took was a convenient report, an aligned doctor, a well-conducted process. I could lose the right to decide even where to sleep. Panic came in waves, especially at night. I thought about waking up one day and being told that I needed to leave, that someone had decided that I was no longer capable. The thought of being taken out of my own home as a stranger made me tremble all over. I tried to talk to my son once again, this time more firmly. He reacted impatiently, saying that I was exaggerating, that everything was under control, that I needed to trust him. That word, trust, sounded almost like a provocation. Confidence was exactly what had put me there. After that conversation, I noticed something even more frightening. He didn't seem worried. There was no guilt, no hesitation. There was certainty. Certainty that I was in charge, that I had nowhere to run, that no one would believe me if I tried to react. It was then that the fear began to transform. It was still there, heavy, suffocating. But along with it came something new, urgency. I could no longer just observe and write it down. If I waited too long, there would be nothing left to save. That night, I sat up in bed and did something I hadn't done in a long time. I prayed. Not by a miracle, but by clarity. I asked for the strength to act before it was too late. I asked for the courage to face whatever came. Because, at that moment, I understood with absolute clarity, if I didn't fight now, I would be erased forever. I didn't immediately realize that I was being watched. I always thought my pain was invisible to others, hidden behind closed doors and polite smiles. But sometimes, someone sees just when you think no one is looking. That's how it came up in my story. That morning, I went out to pick up the garbage earlier than usual. The air was cold, and I felt tired, as if I had aged years in a few weeks. When I turned around, I saw the neighbor standing on the other side of the fence, watching me too closely to be just curiosity. She didn't ask how I was. He asked if I felt safe. That word, spoken so directly, completely disarmed me. I was silent for a few seconds, trying to decide if I should lie, as I had been doing with everyone else. But something in her eyes stopped me. I invited her in. It was the first time in weeks that someone had crossed my door without my son's permission. We sat at the kitchen table, and as the coffee cooled between us, I began to talk. Not everything, but enough. The bills, the power of attorney, the fear of the house, the feeling of disappearing. She listened without interrupting. Without that look of pity, without ready-made sentences. When I finished, she took a deep breath and said something that changed everything. This is not confusion, Helena. This is financial abuse. Hearing that out loud was like naming a monster that I felt but couldn't explain. The neighbor told me that she had worked for years as a legal assistant. He said that he had seen similar stories, always starting the same way: isolation, doubt, control. Every word of hers fit perfectly into what I was experiencing. It was no coincidence. It was standard. For the first time, someone believed in me without reservations. Without questioning my memory, my age, or my lucidity. I felt a relief that almost hurt. It was as if I had spent weeks holding my breath and finally could exhale. She asked me to show the documents I had saved. I trembled as I picked up the hidden briefcase, as if I were committing a crime. But as she flipped through the papers, her countenance grew more serious. That confirmed what she already suspected. Before leaving, she held my hand firmly. She said that I was not alone, that there was a solution, and that I needed to act fast. He spoke of a lawyer, of possible steps, of legal protection. For the first time in a long time, I heard words pointing forward. When I closed the door after she left, I leaned my forehead against the wood and cried. Not out of fear, but out of relief. I was still in danger, that hadn't changed. But now there was something new between me and the abyss, someone who saw the truth. And that made all the difference. After the conversation with my neighbor, nothing else seemed the same. The house remained the same, the furniture in the same place, the silence at the same times. But inside me there was a constant movement, like gears that had finally been unlocked. I was no longer just afraid. I was alert. I waited a few days before acting. Not out of indecision, but out of strategy. She had advised me not to show a sudden change in behavior. So I continued obedient, confused, grateful. Each "leave it to me" of my son was now a silent invitation to observe better. I started to pay attention to dates, values, times. I reviewed old statements, compared papers, connected small dots that once seemed too loose to mean anything. With each new discovery, the drawing became clearer. It was not improvisation. It was a plan in progress. I always found transfers made on days close to my medical appointments. Moments when I was more fragile, more tired, less attentive. I saw patterns where before there was only confusion. And for the first time, I felt angry. Not that explosive anger, but a cold, silent one that organizes thoughts. My son continued to act excessively natural. He spoke of the future, of when all this is over, as if I were just an uncomfortable phase of his life. Sometimes I watched him talk and wondered how long ago he had stopped seeing me as a mother. With the help of the neighbor, I started to put together a timeline. Dates, documents, conversations remembered. Everything was written down carefully. That gave me a strange feeling of power. Not the power to command, but the power to understand. And understanding changes everything. There were times when I almost gave up. When I thought that maybe it would be easier to let it all happen, to accept the role of confused old woman that I was being offered. But then I remembered my home, my history, my name. And that brought me back. The truth did not come out all at once. It was revealed in layers, each one harder than the last. But the clearer it became, the less I doubted myself. That doubt planted with so much care was beginning to die. For the first time since the beginning of everything, I slept a whole night. Not because the problems had disappeared, but because now I had direction. Fear, when it gains a name and form, ceases to paralyze. The next morning, I stared at my reflection in the mirror longer than usual. I saw wrinkles, I saw tiredness, I saw marks of time. But I also saw something new, determination. I was still at risk. But now, I was prepared. The truth was taking shape. And when it was complete, I knew that no one else could pretend that I was just a confused woman. I was about to prove that I still knew exactly who I was. I walked into that office with my heart racing, as if I was doing something forbidden. The neighbor walked by my side, firm, as someone who already knows the terrain. I, on the other hand, felt like an intruder in my own right to exist. Each step felt like a challenge to the narrative they had created about me. The lawyer received us with cordiality, but without excessive sympathy. That reassured me. He asked me to tell everything from the beginning, in my own words. At first, my voice came out low, hesitant. Years of silencing do not disappear overnight. But as I spoke, something was loosening inside me. I told him about the power of attorney, about the closed accounts, about the threatened house, about the old attempt at interdiction. He didn't interrupt me once. He just wrote it down, with concentrated attention, as if every detail had real weight, because it did. When I finished, he took a deep breath and said something that completely changed the way I saw it all. What you are describing is financial abuse against the elderly, associated with psychological manipulation. Hearing that was like having a diagnosis after months of nameless pain. He explained, calmly, that trust does not annul a crime. That kinship does not give the right to absolute control. That the law exists precisely to protect people in my situation. Each sentence dismantled a little more the guilt I carried for having trusted. He also spoke about the risks. About how my son had acted in a calculated way, creating evidence against me, preparing the ground for a possible interdiction. He said that I had sought help at the right time, perhaps at the last possible time. I felt afraid when I heard that, but I also felt something new, validation. It was not an exaggeration. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't drama. It was real, serious and recognized by law. For the first time, someone in a position of authority was on my side. He asked for all the documents I had. I showed the folder, the statements, the notes in the notebook. Each paper reinforced the case. Every detail weakened the narrative built against me. That gave me a strange feeling of balance being restored. At the end of the meeting, he was direct: we would need to act with caution and strategy. No hasty confrontations. Do not warn my son. The plan was to gather enough evidence to turn the tide definitively, and publicly, if necessary. I left the office with wobbly legs, but with my head held high. The world outside looked the same, but I wasn't anymore. Now I knew, what they were doing to me had a name, it had consequences, and it had an answer. As I walked home, I noticed something fundamental. For weeks, I felt small, ashamed, almost non-existent. But there, holding my bag tightly, I understood, I wasn't the one who was wrong. I was the victim. And she was ready to fight. After the conversation with the lawyer, I had to learn something I never imagined: pretending. Pretending that she was still the same confused, tired, dependent woman. Pretending that I had not understood anything. It was strange to realize that, for the first time, my supposed fragility would be used to my advantage. I returned home with careful steps, as if every move could betray what I was thinking. My son looked at me too quickly, assessing my face, my tone of voice, my gestures. I smiled as I always did. A small, docile smile, which he already knew well. I started to agree more. To ask less. When he explained something, I shook my head like someone who doesn't follow properly. That hurt my pride, but it also gave me an advantage. He relaxed. He started to talk more, to commit carelessness, to show himself to be overconfident. I overheard conversations on the phone that weren't for me. Account names, deadlines, amounts. I wrote everything down later, alone, calmly. Each piece of information was one more piece in the puzzle that I was now consciously assembling. There were days when I felt terrible for feigning weakness. It felt like I was betraying myself. But then I remembered what was at stake: my home, my freedom, my identity. Pretending was not lying. It was to survive. My son started to make even bolder decisions. He commented on solving everything soon, on how things would be simpler later. I listened in silence, feeling a chill down my spine. That haste was not careful. It was closure. At night, when she was alone, the mask would fall off. The fatigue came heavy, along with the tension of living in constant alert. But at the same time, there was a new strength growing in me. I was no longer just someone reacting. I was driving. I started to mentally rehearse the day when everything would come to light. Not as revenge, but as justice. I thought about the moment when my voice would be heard without interruption, in which no one could say that I was confused. There was fear, of course. Pretending is tiring. Pretending hurts. But there was also a firm certainty: I was buying time. And, in that silent game, time was exactly what I needed. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw two women. The one that everyone saw, fragile, tired, dependent. And the other, hidden, attentive, strategist. For the first time in my life, I understood that strength doesn't always make noise. Sometimes, she waits. This is the hardest part to tell, the one I tried to hide even from myself. To speak of this means to expose not only the betrayal, but the emotional cost of admitting that someone I loved was able to erase me. If you've come this far, it's because you understand that some truths only survive when someone has the courage to say them out loud. So I ask you, sign up, not as a support for me, but as an act of preservation, so that voices like mine are not silenced again. The day of the hearing came faster than I imagined. I woke up before the alarm clock, with my heart racing and a strange calm mixed with fear. It was as if my body knew that something definitive was about to happen. There was no turning back. I dressed carefully, choosing simple but firm clothes. I didn't want to look too fragile or too strong. I wanted to look exactly what I was, an ordinary woman demanding to be heard. When I left the house, I stared at the door for a few seconds, taking a deep breath, as if saying goodbye to an old version of herself. In the forum, the air was heavy. People came and went, each carrying their own drama. When I saw my son across the hall, I felt a tightness in my chest. He seemed calm, confident, talking to his lawyer as if he were sure of the result. We entered the room and sat down. My lawyer gave me a discreet, firm look. It was a silent reminder that I wasn't alone. As the hearing began, I heard my name being pronounced loudly, clearly, officially. That gave me goosebumps. My son spoke first. He told his version with confidence, describing a confused, forgetful mother, unable to manage her own life. As he spoke, I noticed looks of compassion turn to me. It hurt. But I remained silent, as we had agreed. Then it was my turn. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of each step. When I started to speak, my voice trembled at first, but it soon firmed up. I told my story clearly, without exaggeration, without tears. Just facts. Just truth. The documents began to be presented. Extracts, dates, signatures, the old attempt at interdiction. I saw my son's face change little by little. Trust turned into tension. For the first time, he didn't seem in control. When the judge asked direct questions, I answered accurately. Each answer was a silent proof that I was lucid, conscious, present. The narrative of the confusion began to crumble there, in front of everyone. The heaviest moment was when records of decisions made without my real consent were displayed. It fell like a stone in the center of the room. The silence that followed was deafening. My son avoided my gaze. When the hearing was over, I sat up again, my body tired but my mind strangely light. There was no victory yet. But something essential had already happened. I had been heard. As I left the room, I realized that people looked at me differently. Not with pity, but with respect. At that moment, I understood that that hearing was not just about goods or documents. It was about reclaiming my place in the world. And that, no one else could take away from me. The second hearing was shorter, but much heavier. There was no longer room for rehearsed speeches or vague explanations. Everything that needed to be said was in the documents, in the contradictions, in the proofs that now spoke louder than any words. I walked into that room different from the first time, more tired, but infinitely firmer. My son looked smaller. Not physically, but inside. His gestures were hard, his gaze restless. The security he had displayed before had disappeared. For the first time, I realized that he was afraid. Not from me, but from the truth. When the new documents were presented, I felt the air change. Transfers made on strategic dates, medical decisions made without my consent, attempts to speed up legal processes. It was all very clear now. That was no protection. It was appropriation. The judge asked direct questions. Without beating around the bush. My son responded badly, contradicted himself, tried to justify the unjustifiable. Every word of his seemed to sink him a little deeper. I watched in silence, feeling a strange mixture of pain and relief. That was the fall of someone I loved deeply. At one point, he tried to look at me. Maybe seeking support, maybe asking for silence. I held my gaze for a few seconds and then turned away. Not out of weakness, but because it was no longer my role to save him. I had already spent too much time trying to save someone who was destroying me. The mask fell once and for all when the judge mentioned the old attempt at interdiction. That changed everything. The room fell silent. There was no longer any way to pretend good intention. Planning was evident. Intention too. I felt a huge weight on my chest. It was not satisfaction. It was mourning. I mourned for the son I thought I had, for the family I imagined, for the trust that could never be restored in the same way. But along with this grief came something new, justice. When the preliminary decision was announced, my hands trembled. The control of my assets returned to me. The power of attorney was suspended. Further investigations would be made. I took a deep breath, feeling tears flow without asking permission. They were not tears of victory. They were for survival. As I left the room, I heard whispers, hurried footsteps, doors closing. My son left before me, without looking back. That image was engraved in my memory. Not as revenge, but as closure. Outside, the sun was too bright for those who had spent months in the shade. I closed my eyes for a moment and felt the warmth on my face. I was free. Not whole, not unscathed, but free. That day, I understood something fundamental. The truth does not only destroy those who lie. It also transforms those who survive. And I was no longer the woman who entered that story. The mask had fallen. And, along with it, the version of me that accepted to be erased also fell. I returned home with the strange feeling of having won something I never wanted to fight. The documents were in my bag, but the biggest weight came from inside. Each step to the door seemed to confirm a truth that was hard to accept. I had regained my rights, but not my innocence. That woman who trusted without fear had been left behind. As I opened the door, I was swallowed up by a silence unlike all the others. It was not the silence of vigilance, nor that of abandonment. It was a silence afterwards. A silence that carries everything that has been said, done, and lost. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching the walls as if confirming that she still belongs to a place, and that the place still recognizes her. I sat in the armchair in the living room and let my body give way. The fatigue came in one piece, without asking permission. Months of tension, of pretense, of constant fear took their toll. I cried right there, without trying to contain it. I didn't cry with relief. I cried in mourning. For the son I thought I had raised. For the family I imagined existed. For the confidence that would never be the same again. My phone vibrated that night. It was him. I stared at the screen for long seconds, feeling my heart tighten in an old and familiar way. Part of me still wanted to answer, to hear an impossible explanation, to rescue something that was already dead. But I didn't answer. Some wounds only heal when we stop touching them. Over the next few days, I began to sort out what needed to be resolved. Banks, bills, subscriptions. Every simple gesture felt like a small personal victory. Not because it was difficult, but because they had tried to convince me that I was no longer capable. Signing my name has never been more meaningful. Even so, the pain appeared in the details. In old photographs scattered around the house. On dates that approached without asking permission. In memories that insisted on appearing when I least expected them. Victory does not erase the love that existed. It just reveals that it was used against you. The people around me changed the way they looked at me. Some approached with respect, others with disguised curiosity. Few apologized for having believed the wrong version. I learned that not all injustice is publicly corrected. Some just stop repeating themselves. I started to sleep better, although the dreams were still heavy. She woke up tired, but whole. There was no longer that constant fear of losing everything from one moment to the next. The future was still uncertain, but now it belonged to me. And that made all the difference. I understood, over time, that winning does not mean going back to the starting point. There is no return after the truth. There is adaptation. There is relearning. There is an acceptance that some relationships do not survive the light. On an ordinary morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of hot coffee in my hands. The sun came in through the window, illuminating dust particles in the air. I took a deep breath and felt something settle inside me. It was not happiness. It was something more discreet, more solid. The victory did not erase the pain, but it gave me back something that they tried to take away from me, dignity. And in that quiet silence of my home, I knew that this was enough to continue. Not like before, but stronger than I ever imagined I would be. It took me a while to understand who I had become after all that. It wasn't something that happened overnight. It was gradually, in the simplest details, in the silences that no longer hurt so much. I was no longer the woman I trusted without reservation, but I wasn't bitter either. I was something else. I started to walk around the house with more awareness, as if I were relearning the space. Each room bore marks from the past, but I no longer attached myself to it. There was no rush to change everything. Reconstruction doesn't have to be noisy. Sometimes it happens in slow, steady steps. My son did not show up again. There were distant attempts, short messages, words that sounded too rehearsed to be sincere. I answered only what was necessary. Not for revenge, but for limit. Love without respect becomes a prison, and I already knew this place well. I learned to live with absence. At first, it weighed down. Then, it became a space. Space to think, to breathe, to exist without fear. Not all loss is just loss. Some paved the way for something that would never have been possible before. I started helping other women in the neighborhood, almost without realizing it. Simple conversations, discreet alerts, attentive listening. When I first told my story, I felt my voice tremble. In the second, less. In the third, there was already firmness. Transforming pain into alert was a way to make sense of everything. There were good days and hard days. There were still memories that hurt, dreams that bore old faces. But now I woke up knowing who I was. There was no more doubt planted in me. That confused woman they tried to create was no more. I understood that strength is not the absence of fragility. It's really about continuing with it. It's getting out of bed when it would be easier to give up. It is choosing yourself when everyone expects you to erase yourself in order to keep the peace of others. I looked at my hands the other day and realized how much they had done. They created, cared for, signed the wrong papers and then corrected them. They were wrong, yes. But they also fought. And they won. Not in the way I dreamed, but in the way that was possible. Today, when I look in the mirror, I see marks of time, of pain, of overcoming. I don't try to hide them. They tell a story that no one else can distort. My story. I haven't gone back to who I was before. And he didn't want to. That woman would not survive what I faced. The one that remains is more cautious, firmer, more aware of its own value. If someone asks me who I am now, I answer without hesitation, I am the woman who tried to erase me, and he didn't succeed. I am the woman who has lost a lot, but has not lost herself. And that, in the end, was the biggest victory of all. If this story touched you in any way, please share this video. Not because it's my voice, but because it can reach someone who is experiencing something similar and still can't name what they feel. Sharing is an act of solidarity. It's helping to break a pattern of silence that protects abuse and leaves people alone when they need it most. I'll stay here reading every comment, really. Tell me, from which city or country are you watching and what about this story stayed with you? Your words don't go unnoticed, they come to me and mean more than you realize.